Life can feel like a storm, right? It throws all these challenges at us that can leave us feeling completely lost. But what if the wisdom to navigate these modern storms was already waiting for us in ancient texts? Well, today, we're diving deep into the Psalms to find some real solid anchors for our souls.
It's a question that just echoes through all of human history, isn't it? I think we've all asked it at some point. When things get really tough, when the pressure is on, we just kind of look up and wonder, what is the point of all this struggle?
And then there's the second punch. You're doing your best, you're trying to do everything right, but you look around and you see other people who just seem to have it all. And a lot of times, they're not even good people. It just feels so deeply unjust. These two questions, well, they're right at the heart of what we're going to explore today. All right, so let's get into it. Here's our game plan. We're going to start by digging into those two big questions we just mentioned. Then we'll explore the stories of a king and a musician from the book of Psalms. Their experiences are going to give us some really powerful principles for finding meaning, which will then turn into practical, usable anchors for our own lives. So, to guide us on this journey, we're going to turn to two amazing figures from the Old Testament, King David and a musician named Asaph. Their raw, super honest struggles give us a powerful framework for understanding our own. Okay, first up, King David. Now, we often picture kings living in total luxury, right? But David's life was actually packed with pressure and constant threats. His story isn't really about how to avoid hardship, but about finding its surprising purpose. David gives us this incredible metaphor. He saw his trials as a deliberate process. It's not like God was just playing tricks on him, he was refining him. Kind of like a blacksmith purifies silver in a hot fire. And why? To bring him to a place of abundance. So the key insight here is that the hardship itself was the path to the blessing. And this is where it gets really fascinating. David's faith, his spirituality, it was at its absolute peak when he was on the run, living in the wilderness. The harshness of it all drove him to cling to God. But later, in the comfort and ease of the palace, he fell into a spiritual slumber. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense psychologically. When we have nothing, we're forced to look for a deeper source of strength. But when we have everything, we can get self-sufficient and forget we need anything more. This shows us a critical truth. Unchecked comfort can actually be way more dangerous to our character than hardship ever could be. Okay, so now let's meet our second guide, Asaph. He was a chief musician, and he was tackling that second big question, the problem of injustice. He was just tormented by seeing these arrogant, wicked people living easy, prosperous lives while he was struggling. His story is so powerful because, let's be honest, it's so relatable. There's actually a name for what Asaph was going through: spiritual short-sightedness. It's that feeling when you're so totally consumed by the unfairness of right now that you just lose sight of the bigger picture. It's like a spiritual illness, and believe me, Asaph had a really severe case.
Wow, you can just feel the raw honesty here. He just comes right out and admits it. I was envious. This wasn't some abstract theological problem for him. It was a deeply personal crisis that was literally tearing him apart from the inside. He was right on the verge of losing his faith completely.
So how did he break free from that spiral? This part is so crucial. He took action. He didn't just sit around and wait for his feelings to magically change. He kept praying, even when it felt totally pointless. He brought his doubt and his anger directly to God. And it was in that space, in that honest conversation, that his perspective began to shift. He gained an eternal viewpoint and finally saw that the wicked were on a slippery slope, while true, lasting peace was only found with God. All right, so we've got these two powerful stories: the king who was forged in the wilderness and the musician whose whole perspective was healed. So let's distill them down into a couple of core principles that can give us a faith that can withstand any storm. The first principle, this one comes straight from David's story. Our trials are not pointless. They are the crucible, that refining fire that God uses to purify us and bring out something strong and valuable, like refined gold. So this totally reframes suffering, doesn't it? It's not a punishment to escape, but a process to embrace for our own growth. And the second principle comes from Asaph. When the present is confusing and feels totally unjust, the key is something called sacred remembrance. This is the practice of intentionally, purposefully recalling God's faithfulness in the past. This act of remembering literally becomes an anchor, holding us steady in the middle of all the turbulence. And believe me, the stakes here are really high.
Asaph chose to remember, and it anchored his faith. But in contrast, the ancient Israelites repeatedly forgot God's past rescues. This forgetting grace is a spiritual illness that just leads to despair and rebellion. But remembering God's unchanging nature, that builds real confidence for whatever comes next.
So we have two principles, seeing hardship as refinement and using remembrance as an anchor. But how do we actually apply this ancient wisdom to our lives today? Let's get really practical. And this, right here, might be the most important part. It's one thing to understand these ideas, but it's a whole other thing to build them into our daily lives so they're actually there for us when we need them most. So, how do we do it?
Here's a simple guide, inspired by what Asaph did. First, intentionally take a moment to recall specific times of grace or deliverance in your own past. Second, express gratitude. Thank God not just for what happened, but for his unchanging, faithful character. Third, connect the past to the present. Trust that the same God who showed up for you then is with you right now. And finally, just let that remembrance restore your confidence in his justice and in his timing.
And that brings us to a final thought. David's story teaches us that the wilderness isn't some detour. It's often the very place where our faith is perfected. So I'll leave you with this question to ponder. What wilderness in your life right now might not be a punishment, but a crucible? What refined gold might be forming in you through the very fire you wish would just end? Thanks so much for joining me.